Hey guys, Clint here with ATS Diesel. So hopefully you tuned into the last video talking about some diesel emissions and performance with diesel emissions on, but got to really thinking about it. And I really feel that the best way for all of you to really truly understand is what you do into your trucks is having a better understanding of what happens in this mystery underneath the truck that's called this after treatment system, or the DPF, or the DOC, or all these slang terms that are pulled out. We're beginning to hear those more and more throughout the years now that emissions are something that is here to stay. Well, you know, we've been modifying trucks for almost 10 years now with emissions on. And I got to tell you, it was a bitch in the beginning days. I mean, I was wondering if it was something that was really going to work or not. And over time, you know, year 2, 3, 4, you know, as things continued to progress, you know, we started seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. And today what we have, you know, is a exhaust system works pretty dang well. And what I'd like to do is spend some time with you and kind of help educate in basic terms how the diesel emission system works, how the complete after treatment system works, how the EGR system works. So that's regenerating exhaust in the engine. But before we get into the engine side, I really want to concentrate on this part because this is the limiting factor. The days yesterday when this used to be a straight pipe from the turbo where it came out of the turbocharger and then it went to the exhaust pipe, prior to 07.5, there was literally nothing in this. There maybe was like a basic catalyst that would help reduce some basic emissions, NOx particularly, but it didn't have a filter, didn't have any other stuff. Well, later in years in 07.5, they introduced the diesel particulate filter. Well, today what people generally talk about is the DPF. The DPF is the diesel particulate filter. That's basically an exhaust filter that literally filters everything that comes out of that engine. And to show you what it looks like, how it works, this is one that we've removed, cut out. We put flanges on it. This is one of the new products that we've been offering for a while that's now becoming very popular because you can actually clean your existing DPF. As you see with a regular DPF in these systems, they're all welded. You can't open them. You know, if this goes bad, you clog it up, then you throw it out and you buy a new one for anywhere from $3,500 to $7,000 at the dealership. Well, we'll cover this in a little while, how we can make them serviceable, but the way the diesel particulate filter works is you have all these honeycomb things, and if you were to look through like a catalytic converter, you can actually see all the way through it. So you can see light that what goes through it. With a DPF, you don't see the light because every one of these things that are clogged up are opened on the other end or vice versa. So that means that as the diesel fuel in the air comes through the exhaust and hits your DPF, it actually has to be squished and pressurized through the membrane. It's almost like reverse osmosis type of situation with water, where you actually push it through the filter. Well, as you push it through the filter, that particulate matter, which is the black smoke essentially, unburnt fuel, gets trapped in the trap into the substrate, and that substrate begins to clog up. When it begins to clog up, that filter begins to be more and more restrictive. And that means as that thing clogs up and your back pressure increases in the exhaust system, then your engine can't breathe. And if it can't breathe, no air out means no air in. And if you're not getting air in or air out, then that means you have more black smoke, less power, higher heat. So everything begins to degrade. So I'm going to kind of explain a little bit how this entire system works. And then as we get through the system, then we can start to better understand what happens upstream and what we have to do when we engineer a kit for the turbochargers, the additional fuel pump, the tuning, airflow, that kind of stuff. Very, very important. But you have to make sure that you understand this technology and you address it before you start messing with the engine side. So this is where we're going to start. We basically start, this is where your airflow would come out of the turbos and go into the first canister. Your first canister is your DOC. That basically is your diesel oxidation canister. And essentially what that does is it reduces CO and hydrocarbons. So CO is one of the less intrusive gases that the EPA hounds us about, but still it's on the radar and it's part of the emissions testing. So we have to deal with it. So this is basically a canister that helps us burn off excessive oil. It generates a little bit more heat. It kind of helps the rest of the system. So Your DOC is important. The nice thing about the DOC, it's basically like a catalytic converter. It goes straight through. If you look through the substrate, you can see right through it. So there's a chemical action that happens as it goes through here. Well, then you have still black smoke and sooty gases and a lot of nitrous oxides, which NOx are the number one thing that we fight. NOx is the invisible gas. It's also the most harmful for you, and it is most difficult to deal with. That is basically the reason we have urea injector or diesel exhaust fluid. This injector basically is your diesel exhaust fluid. So as the air is coming through, the urea or the diesel exhaust fluid basically mixes in this premixer, in this kind of deal that's going on. And then as it runs through into this substrate, this basically looks like another DPF, if you will, or basically just a catalyst chamber, but it's also see-through. So it has different materials mixed in with it. And as the urea mixes with the NOx chamber, then it begins to break the NOx down and turn it into a non-harmful gas. Well, this is where things get really, really difficult. We haven't got to the DPF yet, right? We're just sitting here basically the NOx storage chamber. This NOx storage chamber is where like pretty much most of the magic happens. This is where all the really difficult things that the tuners deal with, that we deal with when we're building more power, this is our friend, right? So thank goodness that the scientists came up with essentially something to help us combat NOx after the fact, or we probably wouldn't be driving diesels today. So we really have to think about this as our friend. Now, in order to make this really work, we actually want to deal with things in the engine itself, and that's reducing the NOx to start with. Reducing the NOx comes in the form of EGR, injecting EGR, timing, a lot of things that we do in the control system of the engine that is extremely, extremely important. And along with that is turbo matching. So now we're starting to get into the hard parts of the engine. So again, I'm going to leave the engine out just for a little bit, and I'm going to continue to run downstream. So we've gone through our DOC. We're beginning to mix the airflow with the urea, so we're beginning to neutralize the NOx, hopefully take them down to a safe limit, or at least the limit that the EPA has specified that is okay for us to build products to. Now we still have all this soot, all this black smoke, and all this black smoke and soot gets stuck in your DPF. So this little chamber here is essentially the chamber that's clogged up on every other side, and your diesel particulate filter, or your diesel black smoke and all the particulates, basically, anything that you would see in the air, essentially has to pass through that substrate and get stuck in it. And then we finally have a nice clean exhaust that comes out the backside that is very usable air. So it's a really nice thing. Well, you can only imagine what happens when you start turning up the diesel. You add a program in it, add more fuel. Anything you're doing at all to increase power, short of airflow, is basically taxing the system. Well, think about this in the old days. So say you have an '06 Dodge, and first thing you do is you just throw a program on it. All of a sudden the turbos get super responsive. Power goes up, EGTs go up. The driving fun goes way up, because now we took a diesel that's making maybe 400 horsepower and we're getting another 150, maybe 200 horsepower out of it, literally by adding a programmer to it. Well, in those days, since we didn't have to worry about soot loading, and soot loading is basically black smoke that gets in the DPF, right? So when I talk about soot loading, you're going to hear soot loading, a lot, throughout this chapter, and you're going to hear it a lot with, programmers and people talking about and trying to work through these systems. Well, soot loading is what stops us in our tracks when we're trying to build horsepower. You put a tuner, say in an '06 Dodge, and you give it some more fuel, you burn the fuel in the cylinder, you hit a little bit of black smoke, that black smoke comes out the exhaust, acts almost like a blowtorch. You're still burning fuel as it leaves the cylinder, and it expands in the exhaust chamber, and then it drives the turbine and it makes more boost. Well, immediately you have something, a diesel, where you tip into it and it has immediate response and immediate power and just lights up the turbos. And like, hoo-hoo, everything's cool. I just put a tuner in this thing and picked up 150 horsepower. And it makes a little bit of black smoke. Turn it up a little bit more, it makes a lot more black smoke. Well, these guys, they don't tolerate black smoke. Okay, I mean, they will tolerate like a puff, just a puff of black smoke. And then that black smoke is basically stuck in the particulate, right? And it's stuck in there, and that means that filter is clogging. And as it begins to clog, it gets more restrictive and more restrictive, more restrictive. Eventually, this guy won't flow any air. And we have to make sure that we have airflow, because that's what the diesel lives on. So you back that '06 Dodge, you put a big program in it, and you make some power. Like, well, you know, I know that things would tell me I need a bigger turbo. So next thing you do is you bolt a bigger turbo on it. And remember, we have an open exhaust because we've got an '06 Dodge. So you got a program, you put a bigger turbo on it, the response slows down a little bit, you get a little bit more black smoke on tip in, but as soon as it starts to light, it starts to clean up a little bit, and now you're 200 horsepower above stock. Well, the whole thing is, when you're engineering a system for emissions on, you have to pay attention. You have to absolutely know, in all driving states, cold, hot, heavy loaded, your foot's in it, whatever it is, that you're not going to put your after treatment system, specifically the DPF, into a state that you actually soot load it and you overload the DPF. As soon as you overload this thing, game over. And that's one of the big things that happened from the open exhaust diesels. You know, I want to call that like prior to 07.5, until you have the closed or the active exhausts, 07 and newer. All of the 07 and newer trucks have some version of what you're looking at here. This happens to be a Ford. It doesn't really matter the configuration. They kind of move around. Sometimes you have the SCR behind the DOC or the DPF. It doesn't really matter. The fact is, it goes from A, B, C, and then you get clean air out the back. Well, when you start adding these, you know, in a Ford, Dodge, or GM, then all of a sudden everything changes. You can't just throw a big program in it so it loads the DPF. You can't just change the turbo. You don't have the spool time where it needs to be. So again, it loads the DPF. The ratio between turbo and tuning, or turbos and tuning, is absolutely critical. I mean, it's absolutely a science that has to be made in steps. The tune, the turbos, the fuel system, the injectors, everything that is happening upstream of the engine has to be an engineered, designed, well-balanced kit that increases that airflow gently over time as the fuel is injected, so you maintain that ratio all the way across the board, so this guy will live. Well, kind of getting back to some 101 exhaust system, you know, with the DPF. So this exhaust system begins to soot load, right? You begin to soot load it because, say, you put a bigger program in it, or, you know, whatever you've done to increase the power and increase the fuel. Once it begins to soot load, it gets to a certain point that this exhaust becomes a little bit more restrictive and more restrictive and more restrictive. And at some point, this guy's got to be cleaned. In order to clean it, the only way to do that without physically taking it out of the vehicle and cooking it, you know, to 16, 17, 1800 degrees, is to actually get it up to, you know, 1000, 1200 degrees in the vehicle and let it actually burn the particulate down to where it turns into this a really fine ash. Well, the way that works is it's called regeneration. For those of you that haven't heard of regen or kind of wondering what regen or whatever it is, basically diesel regeneration means that the computer is actively taking an approach to clean the DPF. So the computer says, oh, back pressure is really high. We have all these sensors all over. I mean, you see all these sensors that are all over this exhaust. So the computer is monitoring the health of this after treatment system. Well, as that exhaust comes through here and it begins to clog this up, your back pressure sensors, basically your delta sensors, are registering that there's a lot of back pressure in this DPF coming through. So he says, okay, engine's warm, you have to hit all these parameters, and then you fire off a redundant injector, which well-designed systems, later model systems, have a redundant injector kind of like this, but it's injecting diesel fuel into your exhaust system. Now, one of the reasons, if we go back in time a little bit, some of the reliable DPF after treatment system was, say, the Ford 6.4 Ford. Although it had factory compounds on it and the truck ran great, it had an issue, not so much with the after treatment system, although I know a lot of you will argue that it was a total piece of crap. It was, but those trucks actually do work relatively well in stock form. The after treatment systems on the 6.4 Fords were not engineered well to increase power over stock, like the later ones do really well. Well, go back to 6.4 Ford, the redundant injector is actually the last firing cycle of the injector, or the injectors itself. So as the piston's burnt and all that fuel is coming down the cylinder, then it's all burnt, and then they would fire the injectors after the fact, and it would push raw fuel into this exhaust system. It would start to regenerate this just fine, but the 6.4s would overfuel, or I'm sorry, it would fill the crankcase with fuel. So you pretty much had to change the fuel or the oil in that engine religiously. Otherwise, you're going to have as much diesel fuel in the crankcase as you do engine oil. So that was a poor design system. There's not a lot of getting around it, short of you have to maintenance the 6.4. In other words, you have to change the engine oil religiously. I mean, otherwise it's not going to work. So getting back to the redundant injector, you have a redundant injector that sprays fuel in this, and all of a sudden all that raw fuel passes through, and then it gets stuck in the DPF, and it lights up, and it basically starts getting up to temperature 800, 900, 1,000, 1,200, 1,300 degrees. As it begins to turn this basically into like a cigarette, like coals in a campfire, it begins to burn all that particulate, and it basically cooks it down to a really fine powder that sits in the back of your DPF. These DPFs are pretty reliable. You know, generally the correctly tuned diesel will go 100,000 miles, sometimes a lot more. Often, I mean, we've seen these guys that when everything was perfect, 200,000 miles before they've ever had the DPF off of them. I would generally say, somewhere around 100,000 miles, this should be a serviceable item. Well, everybody, Ford, Dodge, GM says, oh yeah, it's actually absolutely serviceable. We're going to service it with the complete $5,000 exhaust system. Okay, that's not really okay. What's okay is this guy is good, this is good, this is good, this is dirty. So let's just cut this out, put rings on it, clean it like brand new. It's not like it's like reman is not as good as new. They're not damaged, they're just full of soot. So they need to be cleaned. So when you actually cook that substrate down, you completely clean it and you can blow it out from the backside. That means that little bit of ash that's getting packed in there, once you get it hot, you can blow it out, and it makes it like brand new. At that point, weld rings on it, and then this becomes serviceable. And these serviceable rings basically bolt on just like a V-band clamp. So now it's beginning to open up some avenues for us. We can lean on that a little bit harder. If it clogs up a little bit earlier, for whatever reason, then you can service it. You're talking about probably about $1,000 repair or less to cut it out, weld the rings, put it back in. Then it's serviceable. Then it's an easy fix. Later on down the road, take it out, put another cartridge in it, or take it out and clean it. Anyway, it becomes serviceable. And you have something that is going to last the entire life of the entire vehicle. You generally won't have much more than a couple of sensory problems or whatever. So kind of understanding how the after treatment system works is a very, very important aspect of modifying any diesel engine that has an after treatment system on it. Knowing how the DOC works, knowing how the urea chamber, the catalyst, the selective catalyst chamber works, knowing how the DPF works, how they work together, how these work, most importantly, with what's upstream of it, the engine, the EGR, the injection pressure, your airflow, turbos, manifolding, everything else, air density, the quality of the air coming in the engine, what your intercooler efficiency is. All of those things have an absolute, like a huge effect on this after treatment system. So understanding how this works, now we have the knowledge. Now we can go upstream and start working on the engine. And next I'm going to talk to you about what we do with the engine side of things to keep this healthy. So stay tuned, guys. We got a lot more to come. This is an exciting world that we're in. Luckily, we've been living this emissions thing for well over 10 years now. And I'll tell you, we've got some great trucks on the road. You know, Ford, Dodge, and GM. This is not just centered around, you know, the Dodge or the Ford or whatever. You know, all of these trucks, we have pretty much this equal programming for them, turbos, twin fueler, you know, all the things that kind of power these up. And, you know, I don't want you guys freaking out about, you know, what's happening today. I mean, it's very exciting. You know, we're seeing these trucks pretty easily be in that 650 horsepower range. And, you know, that's with us working on it for just the last, you know, 8 or 10 years. And really the real performance side of things have really come like in the last 3 years. And it's very exciting. And it's something that I think you guys are going to really enjoy, especially I've been driving these things so long now, you know, 600 horsepower trucks for the last couple of years for towing, daily driving, just everything, myself, my guys, a bunch of customers. And you don't want to go back. I mean, once you drive these things, they don't smell. In fact, my girlfriend, her daughter got into my Dodge, one of the old Dodges, the old race trucks, just earlier this summer. And we're driving up to Bandimere, and she said, "Hey, Mommy, what's that smell?" And she looked at me and said, "What is that smell?" I'm like, "That's the smell of diesel, you know, like basically diesel." Like, that's a weird smell. And I thought, that was kind of odd because I've been driving these cleaner trucks for so long now that I really have gotten spoiled to them just because they, you know, you just don't have the odor and you know, you're not getting a lot of noise and they're just a lot of fun to drive. So, you know, it's something that you definitely don't want to be scared of. Want to embrace it. It's cool stuff. We just need to learn more and more about it. You know, the newer truck these trucks get, the better equipment they're giving us. So it gives us a lot more room for modifying them and getting these bigger power levers out of them. So it's pretty cool stuff. So check out our Clean Diesel series. We'll explain how we're making 700 or 800 horsepower and keeping the DPFs alive on these trucks. It's pretty exciting stuff.